Hello, I'm Eliezer Yudkowsky. Welcome back to Blogging Heads. With me today is a researcher working on an obscure and little-known disease for which I myself am at risk and of which several of my relatives have already contracted. Dr. Aubrey de Grey, tell us about your research in aging.
Yes, aging is indeed a much less well appreciated disease than it ought to be. After all, it does kill twice as many people as all other causes of death added together worldwide, and in the West, in the developed world, it probably kills roughly 90% of everybody. And yet, most of us don't really think about it that way. We think of it as not really a disease at all. We have somehow convinced ourselves to think about it as something that is so natural and so ubiquitous and universal that perhaps we shouldn't even try to do anything about it. But I don't really agree with that, and as you say, Eliezer, I have decided to try to act on that.
So, what are you doing about this terrible ongoing tragedy?
Well, starting in roughly my mid-20s, 10 or 15 years ago, I started to work hard on figuring out really what the problem was and how we might deal with it from, if you like, an engineering perspective. I did this really because I realized that there were very few other people trying to do this, that nearly everybody who was studying the biology of aging was doing so really more for a curiosity-driven purpose, just to understand it, rather in the same way that meteorologists try to understand the weather without really any aspiration to do anything about it. And I was reasonably successful, or at least I think I was. Especially around the year 2000, I came up with, I guess, a grand plan, an overarching vision of how we might go about combating aging, and indeed combating it very effectively indeed, so effectively that we could call it defeating it. Certainly we can't do that yet, and a large part of what I've been working on since, in fact really everything I've been working on since, has been geared towards hastening the development of the required technologies so that that will all actually occur. In order to do that, I started a foundation called the Methuselah Foundation, jointly with a businessman from Virginia named Dave Goebel, and that foundation is the vehicle within which I have been operating ever since.
So, clearly, well, I don't want to quite say that most gerontologists at this present time do not believe that aging can be cured, because they probably haven't even thought about it as something to be cured. But you have run into some flack from mainstream gerontologists when you talk about actually curing aging. Do you want to discuss some of that?
Sure. The thing I've really bumped into actually is not such an unusual thing in science. The concept that aging is bad for you is, as I mentioned earlier, something that most of the general public are fairly ambivalent about. But actually, gerontologists, people who work on the biology of aging, are pretty much in agreement with me and you on that point. It's just that they don't think we can do anything about it, or at least not anything really significant. And of course, the reason why anyone who's a specialist in any given field comes to that conclusion is on the basis of the spectrum of potential solutions to the problem that they're aware of, and their opinion that none of those solutions actually seems particularly promising. So that means that logically it always has to be kept under advisement, under revision, because at any point someone might come along with a whole new approach that would not actually be subject to the same pessimistic logic that the pre-existing approaches came to. And that's what I did in 2000.
So your approach sends the 7 deadly sins of aging. So before we actually start talking about those particular 7 deadly sins, probably sort of the 2 points of controversy, as it were, would be first the notion that the causes of aging, or rather I should say that the things you need to do in order to fix the many different effects of aging, can compress in that way into a relatively small number of things. And second, the idea of actuarial escape velocity, if I'm saying that correctly, which is an interesting sort of concept that you should probably introduce.
Yeah. Well, actually, I would say there are 3 things. There is the idea that this classification that I've done of the phenomena of aging into these 7 major categories is a valid and comprehensive classification, as you say. And then the second one, which is three, the one you left out, is the idea that we have a respectable fighting chance of addressing each of those categories in the foreseeable future using foreseeable biomedical technology. The third one, as you mentioned, is the concept of what I now like to call longevity escape velocity. That sort of leaves out the question of whether we're talking about individuals or populations and so on. And that's the idea that we will be able, in the relatively near future, to gain enough time to, in other words, effectively rejuvenate the human body sufficiently to give us the margin to develop more comprehensive technologies that will rejuvenate the body more comprehensively, that will give us more time to do it again, and so on. This is, of course, a concept that is not based on science, but rather on looking back at the history of technology. And a lot of people who work in basic sciences really don't like to regard that sort of evidence as admissible. But I think it's unscientific not to regard it as admissible.
Well, this is something on which I've written a bit myself. The distinction between scientific evidence and rational evidence is somewhat akin to the distinction between legal evidence and rational evidence, that science, that we have this sort of formal process called science that we set aside and admit only certain types of evidence in order to produce unusually strong beliefs. For example, I say, I am wearing white socks right now. Are you justified in believing this? I actually hereby give you my word that as I'm speaking, I'm wearing white socks. So are you justified in believing this? Rationally, certainly you should be betting on my wearing white socks more than on any other color per se. But it's not a scientific belief because there's no experiment you can do for yourself to verify that what I just told you is true. It's a private sort of belief. It's not something that anyone anywhere can verify for themselves, and for that reason it can't be part of the special publicly accessible pool of especially strong, well-confirmed beliefs that we call science. Now, the problem is that a lot of people treat unscientific as something of a very strong curse word when what they actually mean to say is irrational or even false. So, for example, there's all sorts of supplements on the market that have unverified claims going for them, and these things are unscientific, but they're also irrational and, above all, false. So the notion of actuarial escape velocity is not, in fact, scientific because there's no experiment you can do in the privacy of your own home to verify that this is how it works. But on the other hand, it's not sort of, I would say, visibly irrational. That is, you do have the sort of evidence at hand where you can say, well, this is the particular historical stuff that I'm looking at, and this is why I'm extrapolating out this particular way. So what is the historical stuff you're looking at, and why are you extrapolating out this particular way?
Right, yeah, I mean, I think I sort of agree with what you characterize this as. I think that, in fact, I would go as far as to say I do agree with it, but I would say that it needs to be amplified or complemented by a different type of distinction between the way that scientists work and the way that technologists work in particular. I think that really it's not so much a case of which types of evidence are admissible, it's more a spectrum of degrees of priority that the different types of people give to evidence. And furthermore, I would go as far as to say that scientists are actually perfectly correct in the way that they treat evidence with respect to the sorts of things that scientists actually do, namely the testing of hypotheses and so on. One thing that they do, which bears rather closely on what you were talking about a moment ago, is they trust each other to a large extent. They actually, read each other's papers or they listen to each other at conferences and they more or less take what they're told at face value. Of course, sometimes they will go to the trouble of verifying by repeating an experiment if it's important for them to do so in order to justify that some large amount of money or time that they were going to spend would be well spent. But by and large, they believe each other. However, I think perhaps even more fundamental fundamental thing about science is that because we're talking about working in, by definition, the unknown, it's very easy to make missteps in the alternation, if you like, between experiment and hypothesis formation, the logic of science. And for that reason, scientists tend to be very much focused on prioritizing the most direct evidence. in order to determine what's actually true and what might not be true. Now that sounds, on the face of it, as though it would make sense in technology as well, when you're trying to build a machine or build some technology to actually manipulate the world in some way. But in practice, it doesn't seem to be so. It seems that actually lateral thinking and looking at rather indirect evidence tends to be rather helpful. I mean, I often give the example of powered flight, where it's perfectly clear that from a basic science perspective, from the way that basic science is normally done, the appropriate way to determine how to actually fly would be to look at birds and bats and so on, and to figure out how to fly by flapping. And we all know that that didn't actually turn out to be the appropriate way to go about that particular problem from a technological perspective. I think we can give plenty of other examples of this.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but why would you say that in terms of basic science, if you wanted to understand flight, you might as well, you might look at birds, you might look at bees. I think to some extent people overestimate the degree to which the scientists of the time were acting in any sort of proper fashion when they said flight is impossible and then got it wrong. When someone has just gotten something blatantly wrong, is probably not the right time to try to learn from them how to do it correctly. So
You're quite right about that. But I wasn't really talking about the scientists who were saying that powered flight is physically impossible. I was talking about the scientists who accepted the evidence of their own eyes that powered flight clearly is possible, namely the evidence of birds and bats and so on, but tried to work too faithfully, too literally within that paradigm, rather than looking at other ways in which it might be easier for us to do it by virtue of our availability of different tools that the natural world don't have.
Well, I myself tend to think that, okay, you've got a bird and it's flapping, but it's not so much that you necessarily want to look at the bird and understand exactly how it flaps. You want to look at the bird and gain something from it that's more abstract than just flapping. But now we're sort of wandering off topic on from aging per se. So,
well, actually, what you just said was exactly a very succinct way of what I was trying to say. So I want to completely agree with what you just said about the business of not looking at it in a sufficiently abstract way. That's exactly what I meant.
So how should we be looking at aging then?
Well, I think that we can actually use this parallel that we were just talking about with regard to powered flight to illustrate the difference between the way I started looking at the problem of aging as opposed to the way that other gerontologists had looked at it. Because some gerontologists had, of course, occasionally looked at the problem of aging as a problem to be solved rather than just a phenomenon to be understood. And what they tended to do was to look at the natural world and, in particular, to try to identify differences between naturally long-lived species and naturally shorter-lived species, with a view to perhaps being able to use those observations and extrapolate from them in order to design potential interventions. And that is a perfectly reasonable initial way to go about it, which, as we all know, hasn't really borne fruit so far, and indeed which was not really expected to bear fruit, because even if one did come up with those differences, it would take a very long time and a lot of technology that we don't have to actually use that information in terms of implementation. So what I did was I stood back and took, as you very rightly said, a more abstract view, and said, well, okay, what do we actually want to achieve? Might there be a different way than simple extrapolation from different species within the natural world? And that was what led me very rapidly, in fact, to realize that a bona fide repair and maintenance approach, a rejuvenation approach, might actually be a good deal more practical within the parameters of biomedical technology than the approach of trying to slow down aging, trying, if you like, to clean up our metabolism so that it doesn't make us age so fast in the first place, which is essentially what the traditional biogerontological approach was.
So in other words, the distinction there is that the gerontologist would study sort of how quickly or how slowly things in the natural world aged, and their main inspiration for what you do about aging did consist of looking at things that aged most slowly and asking how to slow down aging. And you're actually sort of drawing a sharp line there and saying, that what we want to do is not slow down aging, but look at sources of damage that have already occurred and repair those. And if I can...
Right.
Sorry?
That's exactly right. And of course, one of the reasons why this was so counterintuitive and why my colleagues had not really entertained this idea before was that intuitively one would feel that reversing aging, which is essentially what repair and maintenance does, is in some sort of fundamental way harder than slowing aging down, because it's a greater magnitude of intervention, if you like. And really my insight was that, in fact, because of the technology we have available to us, it may actually be easier than slowing it down.
So do you want to expand on that a bit? Because I confess that I myself had the same intuition when for that matter, I still, somewhere in my brain I still have that same intuition that says that surely it's harder to, unscramble the egg than to prevent it from shattering in the first place. But maybe this would be a good time to start on the seven deadly sins as you described them, or?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so of course, in a very formal sense, what I'm saying is not completely true, that reversing aging would be easier than slowing it down, because clearly aging is something that proceeds at a particular rate, and repair and maintenance has to also proceed at a particular rate. So one can imagine a scenario in which repair and maintenance is done, but it's so inefficiently done that it actually proceeds at a slower rate than the process that it's repairing. In other words, the aging process, and therefore aging does continue and it's only been slowed down rather than reversed. In practice, though, what I'm saying is, for practical purposes, true, because the types of approach to slowing aging down that would emerge from comparisons between different species would be ways that intrinsically could not be amplified into bona fide reversal of aging simply by doing them better. Whereas repair and maintenance, by its definition, is such an approach. So if we try to get into the practicalities of this and say, well, okay, what repair and maintenance am I talking about, then that really comes to your question. What are these seven categories of aging and the approaches to fixing them?
Or to be more precise, the seven categories of aging damage. Because,
right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first thing to describe is really what I mean by the word damage, because I always use this word, and I use it in this very precise sense, which is perhaps not immediately obvious. What I use the word damage to mean is the lifelong, ongoing byproduct, side effects of metabolism. So metabolism is a word that is often also slightly misused, actually. It's sometimes used simply to mean the rate at which we consume oxygen, but in biology, the correct definition of metabolism is much broader. It includes the entire network of biochemical and cellular processes that go on in our bodies to keep ourselves more or less intact from one day to the next and from one year to the next. So damage I define as the set of side effects of metabolism that essentially slip through the net and do not actually contribute to keeping us the same from one day or 1 year to the next, but that actually progressively change ourselves, change our composition at the molecular and cellular level. And specifically, I define damage to be those things that accumulate so that eventually they're actually bad for us. They actually get in the way of metabolism, so to speak, and start to make metabolism function less effectively.
So if I can sort of interrupt here to describe what I see as one of the key ideas here, there was this old and I believe now generally, in fact, disregarded hypothesis in biology to the effect that aging was pre-programmed, that it was a, quote, adaptation, unquote, to get the old out of the way to make room for the young. Do you remember what the actual name of that hypothesis was?
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes. So this was put forward by a very famous and prominent German biologist named August Weismann back in the late 1800s, actually. And it was completely accepted by more or less everybody, right up until after World War II. The first person to point out that it must be wrong was an immunologist from England named Peter Medawar. And Medawar's very simple observation, which everyone was really embarrassed not to have thought of themselves, really, was that there are very, very few organisms in the wild that actually live long enough to exhibit this decline, the accumulation of damage to a point that is actually problematic for metabolism. And therefore, there's no ability for evolutionary pressure to act to preserve the genetic machinery, the hypothetical genetic machinery that would be the program for aging, so to speak. And therefore, there could not be such a program, because even if there were one at some point, it would simply disappear. It would mutate into oblivion over evolutionary time.
Well, not to mention that the original hypothesis was a matter of group selection. That is, there's the supposed advantage to the species from having certain individuals die off, but in fact evolution does not operate for the good of a species. It acts on a species, but it doesn't act for the good of a species. It follows whichever genes tend to become more prevalent, and a gene that damages its carriers is going to lose out to genes that don't damage their carriers, and that's simply the way evolution works, and there's not much, and that's more or less all you can say about it.
Well, actually, we have to be a little bit careful about that, because there is more to selection than individual selection.
There is. That's why I did specify the genes rather than the individuals.
Right. The basic concept of group selection is indeed contrary to evolutionary theory. But there is another concept which is very much consistent with evolutionary theory called kin selection, which has to do with the possibility that it may be positive for fitness of a gene for an individual to sacrifice itself in the interests of its immediate relatives. And in fact, a famous biologist from the pre-war area called J.B.S. Haldane actually made a very famous quote about this. He said something like, "I would be glad to lay down my life for 2 of my brothers or 8 of my first cousins," I think he said it. And this is basically the concept of kin selection. Now, one can make an argument for aging in the context of kin selection if there are enough individuals in a population that are surviving into a point where they start going downhill. One needs, however, something additional to that. One needs a requirement that aging should not be the default process. In other words, the process that happens without this machinery. Aging clearly does happen, and it happens at different rates in different species, and we think we understand that in the context of evolutionary theory. But it's all implemented by variations in the quality of our intrinsic anti-aging machinery, rather than having a program for aging.
And again, just to make a couple of clarifications, you talk about aging proceeding at different rates in different species being accounted for by evolutionary theory. You're referring to those species having different trade-offs for I want to reproduce right away versus I want to reproduce later. It's not that they're being programmed to die out. It's that these species have sort of naturally lower mortality rates, and so it makes sense to invest more biologically in keeping the organism alive for longer.
That's exactly it. That's right. If an organism would, in fact, exhibit a lot of death from aging, because it just isn't being killed very often by predators or by starvation or hypothermia or whatever, then that will confer evolutionary pressure to live longer and combat aging, and therefore essentially to develop more sophisticated anti-aging machinery.
And live healthier longer, we should note. In other words, you have to be healthy enough to reproduce. So if your maximum reproductive age is 40 and everyone is living to 40, there's going to be a pretty strong evolutionary pressure to be able to reproduce at age 45.
That's exactly right, yes. And luckily we have the good fortune that these things go together. Being frail and unhealthy is fundamentally risky. You are at much greater risk of imminent death than you are if you're healthy. And therefore, healthy lifespan and total lifespan do tend to be very closely interlocked.
In evolution.
In evolution, and luckily also in the human world today, in civilization. It's still very hard, even with medical care, to keep someone really frail alive for very long.
Well, but we actually do have something of a social problem at this point, where we've got our medical technology stuck in this really awkward and awful place for it to be, where we can keep people alive longer but not quite keep them healthy longer.
Yes and no. It should be understood that actually we can still only keep people alive in a severely disabled state on average for a couple of years. And actually that has not changed over the past, let's say, 50 years. Since World War II, we've seen an increase in life expectancy in the industrialized world of quite a respectable amount, certainly more than 10 years, something in the region of 15 years. And that has resulted not from our ability to keep frail people alive for a lot longer time, but rather from the fact that people are living their entire lives in a healthier state, and they're living basically a longer healthy life, and only roughly the same amount of time unhealthy at the end of life.
Huh. I'm actually surprised by that. That wasn't the impression one gets from reading the popular stuff, I guess.
I agree.
So But I remember that for me, sort of one of the key aha moments when I was looking over your stuff was at the point where you said sort of like, well, our metabolism ordinarily has to keep us alive. It ordinarily has to repair almost everything. Like if it didn't repair a whole lot of things, you would just sort of fall over, and therefore there's only sort of 7 major categories of damage that accumulate slowly enough to result in aging, but not quickly enough to kill you right away. And
that's exactly right.
Right, and those 7 categories would be, because
So
I don't
the
remember
first
them
one-
off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so the first one is loss of cells. So there are various tissues in which cells die at a respectable rate, and in most of those tissues, those cells are replaced at the same rate by the division and differentiation of other cells. But there are some tissues in which, as you correctly say, the rate of cell loss is rather slow, and it basically doesn't cause much of a problem for several decades. And in those tissues, we've lost the ability to replace those cells. So various areas of the brain, this is true, also the heart and 1 or 2 other places. And the result is eventually the number of cells in those tissues goes down to a point where the tissue doesn't work as well as it would. Number 2 is the opposite of number 1, an overabundance of cells. And there are 2 ways in which this can happen. So the second of my 7 categories is that this happens because cells forget how to die. There are certain tissues in which cell turnover is really important, and cells need to die in order to allow new cells to proliferate and replace them. And when cells get into a state where they refuse to listen to the signals telling them to die, then that's bad for us. The second way in which you get too many cells, which is the third of my 7 categories, is when cells are dying at a respectable rate, but they're proliferating at an even greater rate. This is, of course, cancer, uncontrolled proliferation of cells. And that's certainly something we have to deal with because it certainly kills us. The fourth type of damage is mutations in a special part of the cell called the mitochondria, which is essentially the part of the cell that does the chemistry of breathing, that does the combining of oxygen with nutrients to create carbon dioxide and to release energy from those nutrients so as to keep the rest of the body going. Mitochondria have their own DNA, not very much of it, but that DNA accumulates mutations, and there's very good evidence that those mutations are bad for us, especially during aging. Number 5 is the accumulation of indigestible molecules, literally byproducts of metabolism, that are created accidentally and that are somehow resistant to the various types of degradation machinery, garbage disposal machinery that we have in the cell. And those things are basically sequestered. They're just squirreled away in a particular part of the cell, usually called the lysosome. And in there, they, again, don't get in the way at all for quite a long time, just in the same way that garbage in your house doesn't get in the way for a week. But eventually, there's so much of that stuff, rather as if you didn't take your garbage out for a month, that the cell doesn't work so well anymore. Number 6 is very similar to number 5 in terms of what it is. It's the accumulation of indigestible molecules, but I classify it differently because it's in a different place. In this case, the accumulation is outside the cell, in the spaces between cells. And the reason it's useful to classify it differently is because the way that we're going to go about fixing that problem is different. And the 7th one is also in the spaces between cells, in the extracellular space, as we call it, but this time it's not the accumulation of undesired molecules, it's the accumulation of undesired changes to molecules, especially linkages, new chemical linkages between long-lived molecules. The reason this is important is because a lot of the long-lived molecules in the extracellular space are molecules that are parts of structures that are elastic. So we can think of, for example, the lens of the eye or the artery wall. And these additional spontaneously generated chemical linkages between the component proteins of these structures tend to make them less elastic and therefore not work so well. So we need to fix that.
And what would you say is, well, sort of 2 questions. I mean, personally, whenever I look at a list like that, I think to myself, is it really complete? So I do think that something perhaps underemphasized in your usual presentation of this is the question, suppose there's something else that isn't on the list. or even like what's the probability that there's something that isn't on the list, and what happens if you only fix 5 out of 7 problems? What kind of benefit do we get from that?
Okay, so you're quite right that those are two separate questions. So let's answer the second one first. The question, what would we get if we fixed only a subset of these 7 problems? And the answer is, we probably wouldn't get very much, because all of these problems progress at an accelerating rate during aging, and indeed the consequences of those problems, the various pathologies, the various diseases and so on that they cause, definitely progress at an accelerating rate, which means that even if we did fix most of them, the acceleration of the advances of the others would be enough to kill us pretty soon after we, on average, die at the moment. So I feel that we are absolutely in the game of trying to fix all of these things in order to get a significant advantage in terms of life extension and in terms of healthy life extension. The question of whether there is any more, any 8th or 9th deadly thing that we need to address is also, of course, a very important question, but actually it's even more important when it's slightly rephrased. I think it's almost certain that there are additional things out there, but what we need to know is what is the probability that they're out there and we're going to come across them really rather soon after we fix the other things. And the good news here is that I think there's a very strong argument, in fact a couple of very strong arguments, that say that we're not going to come across such things anytime soon. The first argument is a straightforward biological one. One thing that we can say about damage, as I'm defining it, is that it accumulates only in long-lived structures. Because if you've got, let's say, a protein that is constructed in a cell, and it's got some job to do, and it does it for a while, and then it gets damaged, and then that protein is broken down, and the undamaged amino acids are reused in other proteins, and the damaged amino acids are excreted out of the cell and eventually out in the urine, then that doesn't count as damage, because it's not accumulating, it's gone, and therefore it can't actually contribute eventually to age-related pathology. So that means that we can just look at the body and say, well, okay, what are we made of, and what parts of what we're made of are long-lived? And we can think of, DNA, for example, or proteins and other molecules that are not adequately broken down and excreted when they are damaged, and so on. And by that sort of reasoning, we can come up with basically the list that I give, with plus 1 or 2 additional things that I have very strong reasons to believe do not contribute to normal aging. Additionally, we can actually give a somewhat circumstantial argument. We can say, well, okay, how long has it been since it was only 6 things or 5 things and so on? And the answer is a very, very long time indeed. It's been more than 25 years now since this list was added to. For the last 25 years, all of these 7 things that I talk about have been very prominently discussed and analysed by gerontologists and fingered as important potential contributors to the process of aging in mammals. And you would think that in the time that's gone on there and the advances that we've made in our ability to analyse systems of biology, that we would have actually come up with some more if there were any more. Now, when I say that there will probably be some in due course, what I'm saying there really is that, yes, biology is very complicated. It may be very, very complicated, more than we know. But there is this variation that exists between different individuals, such that some individuals are more susceptible to cancer than to heart disease, for example, and some individuals the other way around. If there were something out there that was just around the corner, that a lot of us would die of if we fixed all of these things, and we would die of that new thing only, let's say, 5 years later, then really, it stands to reason that there would be some people out there who were unusually susceptible to that new thing, and we would have seen it by now in some people. The fact that
we would have seen them dying, but would we necessarily figured out why they were dying?
You ask a very good question. We would have to actually do some sort of analysis of this, but I think we probably would at this point. I think that we've looked pretty hard at the etiology of all the significant killers, age-related killers as well as age-independent killers, and we have a pretty good idea of their molecular and cellular basis. So, the major ones. So I think we can be fairly solid about this argument.
Well, suppose we snapped our fingers and cured all 7, or to be precise, we became able to repair all 7 sources of damage right now. How long do you think we'd last? Like barring accident and so on. Like how long would it take for something else to bite us?
At this point, I think we can only put a lower bound on that. I think we can say that it really ought to give us at least 20 or 30 years, because that's the sort of amount of time that it would take for something that we just didn't see at all at the moment to become prevalent in the population. I think
We're
in
by
practice,
20 or 30 years, sorry, by 20 or 30 years, do you mean 20 or 30 years beyond 70 or 20 or 30 years beyond 120?
I mean 20 or 30 years beyond 80. I mean, 80 being the average sort of age that we have at the moment. And so I certainly mean that some people will live 20 or 30 years beyond 110, the way that some people live to 110 already. But the average, I was talking about the average age that people would reach. In practice, I really want to emphasize that this is a lower bound. I think that actually we would be very likely to live a lot longer than that because of the other arguments that I gave. The argument to do with breaking things down, looking at what we're made of, cells and stuff between cells, what are cells made of, and just looking for long-lived structures that could be accumulating damage.
So, I mean, when I look at this problem, I immediately see that there's a certain class of persistent structures that don't automatically get recycled, and here I'm referring to connections between neurons. So, I mean, this may be a reflection of my own background in the cognitive science side of things, but of course I look at this and I wonder, okay, well, how long does it take for your brain to saturate with new information and so on? But, I mean, I'll quite understand if you want to say, that's not quite my problem, if this is just to give you an extra 30 years to start with. But that is the first thing that comes to my own mind.
Okay, so that's not what I'm going to say. I'm going to give you a rather straighter answer. I'm not too worried about the brain getting saturated, and the main reason I'm not worried is because I'm pretty sure that even by our age, we're already forgetting old information at pretty much the same rate that we are learning new information.
What a wonderful and consoling person you are, good sir.
Well, you see, I think that's fine. I mean, I think there are ways, of course, in which we can train our brains to store more information. I'm not even sure it's a worthwhile thing to do, because obviously we have so many extracorporeal ways of storing information these days. But my point is that the information that we're forgetting is the information that doesn't matter to us very much, because the process of recalling a memory, of course, reinforces it. And indeed, there's been studies done by psychologists that have looked at the life course and asked, what do we remember? And they've come up with a very interesting phenomenon, which is called the reminiscence bump. The reminiscence bump is the name given to the period of adolescence, which turns out to be the peak of the time from which we remember stuff most. If you're 40 years old, you tend to remember the stuff that happened during adolescence better than the stuff that happened during your 30s. Of course, but the past couple of years before the present, you remember the best. But going back before then, the stuff you remember best is actually in adolescence. And it turns out that if you're 50 or 60 or 70, the same is true. You remember the stuff that's only a few years ago best, but other than that, you remember stuff in adolescence. Perhaps because it was the most interesting stuff, the stuff that stuck in your mind most, and the stuff that you recall most often.
Well, that certainly counts as my gloomy fact for the day, because you just told me that I have already, in a certain sense, reached my maximum mental age. I can get older beyond this point only by losing parts of myself that have already accumulated, and furthermore, in some sense, I'm already bound to the person I was at, say, age 15. What a dreadful thought, more tightly than I can ever end up bound to any future self. So that's definitely my gloomy fact for the day.
If you were bound to the person that I was at age 15, you'd be much happier, I'm quite sure.
No comment. Sure, but then I would be an older Aubrey de Grey rather than an older Eliezer. So let's see. So we're about 38 minutes in, so we might want to move on a bit to discussing some of the philosophy of the whole anti-aging endeavor. Of course, that's a bit difficult to do because you and I are essentially in complete agreement that this is a horrible, horrible thing that needs to be stopped as soon as possible.
Yes, I agree. It's a bit tricky. Let's have a go.
Yes. So we, you probably get quite a lot of the people were meant to die. You know, like I was sort of smiling earlier when you were talking about cells that refuse the instruction to die off and keep on living for too long, choking up the system, because, of course, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind of a majority of people when you talk about slowing down human aging.
It's certainly one of the things that come to the minds of a lot of such people, yes. And I find that it's a very good example of the irrationality that overwhelms people whenever they are confronted with the requirement to actually think about this properly. I feel that actually I have some sympathy with this, what I like to call the pro-aging trance, this complete abandonment of all normal sense of proportion and sense of self-criticality. Because really I feel that until recently, when people like me have started coming along and actually pointing the way to how to deal with aging and showing that we may be in striking distance of doing so, until that time, it was actually completely rational for people to engage in this absurd psychological self-manipulation, because the consequence, of course, was the people could get on with their miserably short lives and actually, make the best of them, rather than spending their time preoccupied by this terrible, ghastly thing that was going to befall them sometime distantly in the future.
That's not actually the way I tend to use the word rational, but I might agree that the people who were being irrational did get away with it for a time and get some short-term benefits. But then again, for a while, people investing in subprime mortgages got away with it. And it's predictable that at some point you're going to have to think about these things rationally. Not that there was ever a point where you shouldn't be thinking about them rationally, but I should say it's predictable that at some point your irrationality is going to come back and sting you. But, of course, if you're thinking about it irrationally, it's not like a little sign pops up and warns you, okay, now you're going to get hit with the consequences.
Well, I don't really agree with that. I think the difference really between the situation with aging and the situation with subprime mortgages is the relative time frames. The rate at which we have made progress against aging, or indeed had any reason to believe that we would make progress against aging, was very slow compared with the rate of aging. In other words, people who were experiencing it would consider that they had a high probability of not living long enough to see any benefits, even if they did work to actually hasten those benefits. Whereas in the case of the economy, one might have predicted that it wouldn't last more than a small fraction of your average person's lifespan. I think that really makes quite a difference to the argument.
Well, I don't know. I mean, do you really think that anyone who's saying, well, aging is a good thing, is literally thinking to themselves, okay, on the one hand, aging is a bad thing, but on the other hand, if I think it's a good thing, I'll be happier in my life. But on the third hand, that means that my children may eventually die of aging when they don't have to, because I didn't support research now. But on the fourth hand, I don't care what happens to my children. I don't think that's actually a plausible sequence of thought, and I think that
I'm afraid it really is. I mean, of course, for suitable definitions of the word thinking, because of course this is not conscious, right? This is something that is sort of mutual hypnosis, and that's why I call it the pro-aging trance. But my experience is certainly that the extent to which people are really willing to act in the interest of their children, or let alone their more distant descendants, is unbelievably small, actually, in this respect. For example, I mean, let's take the example of very, very wealthy people that I speak to a lot in my fundraising and outreach activities. I find that actually people our sort of age, people who think they might have a chance of personal benefit, are much more receptive than people in their 70s or 80s who basically know that the sort of thing I'm looking at won't be in time for them. And I have actually done the experiment of explicitly saying, well, who cares if it's not in time for you? It'll be in time for your kids, won't it? And it doesn't seem to make any difference.
Maybe, I mean, you don't think that there's a bit of a spurious correlation there from you're younger, you grew up with higher technology, your mind's still a bit more flexible, you're willing to believe that the future can improve?
I would not deny that there will be a contribution from that. But some of the people I speak to in this respect are definitely not, hidebound mainstream types. They're mavericks one way or another. They've got where they were by being individualistic. They're proud of being of going against the grain and all those things. So one would think, and they're generally pro-technology. So one would think that they would not be affected by that sort of reasoning very much.
Well, sure, but that's how they got where they are, but now they're there, as it were. Mm-hmm. And there's the old story of the sponge that swims to a certain place and then it no longer needs its brain, so it eats it, which is always analogized to getting tenure. But even there, I mean, being an entrepreneur in the 1950s is not like being an entrepreneur in the 1990s. And, I would think there would still be a correlation in are you willing to believe that biotech can advance fast enough to deliver anti-aging results?
Sure, I'll give you that. Of course, one could argue that the speed is not really the issue, because even if you are interested in your kids, but you don't think it's going to be soon enough for your kids, then there's your grandkids and so on. I mean, I think these are. I'm not trying to disagree with you sharply here. I think that there is definitely a contribution from the sorts of influences that you're describing, but I do very much get the impression that the willingness to think in terms of one's children, let alone in terms of humanity as a whole, which is the way that I think about it, is much less than one would have hoped and predicted.
Yes, I mean, there's also that, I mean, in terms of things that annoy me personally, there's the suggestion that people who are interested in anti-aging research are these selfish people who are only interested in living longer for themselves, where, in fact, as you and I are both very well aware, if you actually look at the people doing this, they tend to think and talk about humanity as a whole. I mean, maybe you and I, unusually so relative to the sheer average anti-aging advocate, to an unusual degree, would be concerned with the idea that humanity has got to stop falling over at age 70 eventually, and we may as well do that as soon as possible. But in general, I think it's safe to say that most of the anti-aging rhetoric deals with humanity, not the benefit to not that you're so precious you should live forever. I mean, you are so precious that you should live forever, but you there is plural.
Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself. That's exactly right.
So I feel like we ought to be discussing, in some sense, our shared agreement that, in point of fact, people should not just be discarded into the dust heap when they reach age 70. But it's a bit hard to discuss this properly when we both already agree on it. So I don't know if we should just move on or what.
Yeah, sure. If you have another topic, then go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to think of what else there is to cover here. I may just start going ahead and asking questions that I'm personally curious about with respect to your general philosophy and so on. So I haven't seen you discuss cryonics much, and if you want to say, well, that's not my bailiwick, I'd rather not discuss it, I'll understand that part. But if you have anything to say about that, I'd be curious. Where cryonics is the practice of freezing people when they stop breathing so that their brain doesn't decay, and then quite a bit later, perhaps, you have sufficiently good nanotechnology to bring them back.
Sure. Actually, I do discuss cryonics quite a bit in the mainstream media, and I actually find that it's very useful to do so. I feel very privileged to be pretty much the only mainstream scientist who's in a position to speak authoritatively about these things in a positive light, because I feel that actually the irrationality that is exhibited by so-called experts in cryobiology with regard to cryonics is even more extreme than the irrationality exhibited by most mainstream biogerontologists when it comes to combating aging.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. It actually does seem a lot more flagrant in the cryonics field, and precisely for that reason it might even make a good illustration of what goes wrong in a more subtle way with gerontology.
Right. Yeah. So, for example, Alcor, one of the major cryonics companies, produced a film a year or two ago that discussed the practice of cryonics and talked a lot about the major misconceptions about the fact that it's actually not very expensive, the fact that it's biologically reasonable because it's not bringing people back from the dead, it's just bringing people back from a state where they're legally dead, all of these things. And one thing they did was they interviewed a very prominent cryobiologist who has been a long time opponent of cryonics. And this cryobiologist was absolutely clear that he was very much in favour of the research going on to vitrify human organs for the purpose of improving the supply of human organs for transplantation, for example, so that you could get an organ from one side of the world to another because it was immunologically matched. Which you wouldn't be able to do if you had to keep it only under dry ice, for example. It wouldn't survive well enough. And yet he said that doing this for whole people or even for the brain was just nonsense. And unfortunately, in the film, he was not cross-questioned on this to ask him to elaborate on what difference he saw with the brain versus other organs that made it so laudable and plausible that people were working to perfect vitrification for the other organs, but yet that it was complete science fiction to suspect that we would ever do it for the brain. I feel that that is the fundamental question that cryobiologists have to answer if they want to give scientific legitimacy to their skepticism about cryonics, and I've never heard any of them do so.
So, but wouldn't this contradict your earlier statement that the old wealthy people who you talk to, and at whom I'm betting, do not say, this anti-aging stuff isn't going to work in time for me, I better go run out and sign up for cryonics? I'm betting, I could be wrong, but I'm predicting that they don't actually say that.
You're absolutely right, they don't say that, and in fact the people who are most inclined to sign up to be cryopreserved are precisely the people who are in favour of the work on the avoidance of cryonics, in other words, on getting to a point where they will be able to survive in a nice youthful state without being cryopreserved. Now, I guess this actually does make sense in the latter part, in other words, that people who want to avoid aging will also actually be predisposed to signing up for cryonics, because those are the people who are being rational about this and wanting to make sure that if they're investing in plan A, in other words, not aging so much, then they ought also to invest in the backup plan B of being suspended, so that if they do end up going downhill, then there's a chance of being rescued eventually. But conversely, it actually sort of makes sense that people who are thinking irrationally about the prospect of combating aging will also be most predisposed to think irrationally about the prospect of cryopreservation and resuscitation from a cryopreserved
It's not just the
state.
pro-aging trance, it's the pro-death trance. I mean, probably even it starts out as the pro-death trance, and then aging just must be good because it helps you die.
Yes, I think you may be right. I think it probably goes a bit further than that. I think that the whole concept of what death is something that's bound up in the pro-aging trance, that it's sort of the release from aging. And so we feel very psychologically very comforted by the fact that we have this pretense that death is this well-defined thing that you go in an instant from being alive to being dead, as of course is true from a legal sense, but not from a biological sense. And so I think these things are very closely linked.
But you see my general point then, that why it is that I'm proposing that that if there's a correlation where, as it were, the older people don't get the notion of let's stop aging, and they also don't get the notion of chronics. You can't explain that by pointing to the anti-aging stuff isn't going to work in time for them. These people do have no realistic option except chronics, and they're not taking that option.
Well, right. That's right. That's exactly correct. And I think perhaps this goes some way towards the explanation for why these elderly people are so irrational about their kids and so uninterested in giving this to their kids, even though they're perfectly interested in giving lots of other things to their kids, like money and so on.
And if you want to die yourself, you're not going to be interested in rescuing your kids, I suppose.
Or yeah, at least if you don't want not to die, at least if you're not actively trying not to die, then I think that's correct. Yes.
Well, as the saying goes, die or live forever, you have to do one or the other.
That's absolutely right.
So, but do you see, I'm actually sort of wondering, because do you actually go around saying, like, here's the anti-aging stuff, and then at the end add, like, but sign up for chronics just in case it doesn't work, or?
I do sometimes say that, yes. I mean, of course, I always have a lot to talk about, and so I tend only to answer the question that I'm asked. But yes, increasingly people do ask me about cryonics, whether on camera or at talks, and I'm always very forthright in saying exactly that, yes.
What do you envision as the state of humanity? I won't even ask post-aging, but let's just start with, suppose you manage to knock out SENS. What happens to the world?
You mean what happens in terms of how society changes?
I'm just sort of wondering whether you have a vision of how the world ought to be that includes that includes rejuvenation or being able to slow down aging, et cetera, if you're just saying, well, this is a problem, I know I have to fix it, and I put sort of justified confidence in society reorganizing itself in a better fashion once this problem is fixed, but I don't necessarily claim to know the exact pattern of the society. I'm wondering whether you're sort of a visionary who's got a vision who includes anti-aging, or if you're just sort of moving to attack the problem.
Huh. Wow, that's a hard question. I guess really I'm a first things first sort of guy. I mainly think about what the immediate problem is. I want to stop people getting sick. I'm not really very strongly driven by the prospect of living a long time for the sake of living a long time. I certainly think it's a good thing. I think it's a side benefit, but I regard the priority as stopping people from getting sick. I'm very happy that will probably mean, if we do it really well, that people will live a lot longer, and I think that it's very important for me to carry on talking about longevity escape velocity, for example, even though it's the thing for which my colleagues in the biology of aging most strongly deride me. But yeah, I mean, ultimately I'm a practical sort of first things first sort of guy.
When occasionally hears people sort of accusing people like me of you of being driven by a personal terror of death, and I don't know if I spend all that much time being horrified by the prospect of personal death, but I will admit that the thing you're supposed to be trying to protect me against, aging, on a personal level, completely horrifies me. It just seems absolutely dreadful. And what would like how long does it take before you can protect my brain in particular? Like what's in the pipeline for that sort of thing, and what do you think the prospects are in the near term? And I know that this is a dreadful question to ask, but I'm sort of wondering anyway what you can do for me before I hit 40.
Before you hit 40? I thought you were 40 already. I don't pay attention.
Yeah, next 10 years, next 20 years.
All right.
It's not even all that far off from my brain's expiration date. It's pretty scary.
So, of course, you're quite right that this is a tricky question to answer. And, in fact, most of my colleagues absolutely refuse to answer any questions to do with timeframes for progress in combating aging.
And I refuse to answer questions like that on artificial intelligence, so I'm being a complete hypocrite here, but I'm asking anyway.
Well, excellent. Okay, because I think it's actually irresponsible for those of us who think we know about these things to give no answers. I think that we obviously do have to be extremely emphatic in communicating the speculative nature of our answers, but I think that if we don't give answers at all, then we're basically encouraging or essentially demanding that our audience should make up their own answers, and their answers are simply not going to be as good as ours.
That's a good point.
So I definitely feel in the case of aging that if I don't give an answer, then people are going to carry on thinking that this is just never going to happen, and they're going to act accordingly. In other words, they're not going to agitate to hasten the development of these therapies.
Or they're going to think that it's going to happen inevitably anyway in 5 years. I mean, it depends on your audience, really.
You're quite right, and actually, I think there are some people in that category. I think there are more people in the former category that I described, but there you go. You're quite right in both cases. So, yeah, I mean, I say that I think we have a 50-50 chance of achieving the real breakthrough, getting to longevity escape velocity within about 25 or 30 years from now. And in terms of how to communicate the speculative nature of that, I always say that I think there's at least a 10% chance that we'll get unlucky enough that we won't get there for 100 years. Okay? So that's the sort of the mean and the variance, so to speak. And I think certainly that you ought to be giving that same sort of answer when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Well, I guess I haven't really been giving enough of that sort of answer because of the degree to which I feel it's tentative. But your point that if I don't give the answer, the audience literally has no choice but to make their own guesses, which can only be based on even less information, is actually a very good one, which I hadn't quite thought of. So, but again, do we have stuff that's at all effective against anti-aging in the pipeline now, or do we just need more basic research at this point?
We're halfway between those two extremes. We don't have stuff that's effective against aging, but we do have, I think, stuff that is close enough to that the problem is more of an engineering problem now, more of a technology problem than a basic science problem. I think that we certainly have things we really still need to figure out, but those things are relatively detailed. The big picture that we have, that I've set out over the past 8 or 10 years now, is a big picture that seems to be, surviving the test of time, so to speak. It's a divide and conquer strategy. It subdivides the problem of aging into a variety of different sub-problems, and it proposes solutions to each of those ones. Some of those solutions are considerably closer to implementation than others, but it seems pretty unlikely that the overall structure will indefinitely fail. Ultimately, this is the way we ought to be going about trying to address this problem, and it's just a matter of time before it succeeds.
So we're getting toward the end of the dialogue now, so do you want to say what the Methuselah Foundation is, how large you are, and how large you want to be?
How old am I? How old do I want to be? Wow. Okay.
No, how
44.
large is the Methuselah Foundation, and how large do you want the Methuselah Foundation to be?
I'm sorry, I'm with you. Yeah, okay, so at the moment the Foundation has taken in a total of something in the region of $11 or $12 million, out of which roughly $4.5 million is stuff that we don't spend because it is the pot for the Methuselah Mouse Prize, the M Prize, which we award for unprecedented mouse longevity. The rest of it we're spending as fast as we get it because it's being used for the support and funding of research. And our budget this year for research, this past year, has been something in the region of $2 million. Now, that's definitely not big enough. I think that I would know how to spend up to something like $100 million each year. In particular, I think that if we had that sort of funding, we would be in a position to set up a physical facility that a lot of the work would be done in more efficiently than it could be done by extramural research support, which is how we're doing things at the moment. So certainly extramural research would continue to be a major component even if we were up to that funding level. But yeah, those are the sorts of numbers.
And if I can quickly explain that the Methuselah Mouse Prize is a prize for either very long-lived mice or taking a mouse that has already lived for a certain time span and then extending its life further. So there's the mice where you can slow down their aging starting from birth by whatever means you like, and that's one prize. And then there's the mouse that has to age normally for a while, and then you take it and you try to extend its life out from there, which is the second prize. And how much is the current prize for that?
Okay, yes, you have it exactly right. So those two prizes, the first one, where you can do anything you like, is called the Longevity Prize, and that actually has only a small minority of the money. I don't remember the exact amount, but I think it's something in the region of only 10% of the amount that has been given to the other prize, the Rejuvenation Prize, as we call it. And so the Rejuvenation Prize must be in the region of $3 or $4 million right now.
Okay, so anything else, or shall we wrap up?
I think we've covered a lot. I think we can stop now.
Thank you very much, Aubrey de Grey, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Eliezer. Bye-bye.